And I'd like to open up for questions.
Would you take that money?
I think I'd go with the utilitarian solution, because you're maximizing that public benefit, and you're ensuring both short-term and long-term stability for the organization. So yeah, but I would make it a community event, and I would embrace the dialogue. I wouldn't put just back on stage. I'd get many people there, because it's part of the mission to create that dialogue. Yeah.
Not to be argumentative, but wouldn't if the theater's mission is about creating theater, how does a political speaker meet that mission, even if you do create a diversity of speakers?
It'd have to be the right organization. It'd have to be an organization that had some sort of history beyond doing just performances. So you're right, if it's a theater like Intiman or the Rep, it wouldn't fit into the mission. If it's more of a presenting organization, then it probably would fit. Whoa.
Maybe it should be, David, as a lack of a better term, as a theater person, how does the things that you have found in your study will now translate into your work in the theater?
What has been solidified for me is the idea of making ethical decisions based on values that are held both by myself and by the organization. As a leader, I think you have to balance both.
David, you had mentioned at one point, maybe it was a mistake on the part of, I guess, outsourcing the administration, or administrative.
It's a trend that I've seen happening, and I think it can compromise the public good, ultimately in the long term, if you're disconnecting those two parts of the organization.
And I'm just curious, could you just give like a specific example of, what's the example of like one of these companies outsourcing, what part of their?
There's a company in the Midwest that is now doing all the administration for many theater companies, many presenting organizations, so that they can focus on the art. And this one central organization is doing all the budgeting, all the marketing, all of the communications for multiple organizations. They have the resources and the materials and the ability to do it. And so all of the arts organizations are experiencing short-term benefit because they are free to create the art. But long-term, they're going to lose that support because there's going to be that disconnect. Laura?
You mentioned the 30-something% that have ethics-related documents. Can you give a couple of examples of what type of documents you saw those organizations having? Or do you know?
I don't know from the survey. The question was asked in 3 different categories. Do you have an ethics document? Do you have other related documents, such as employee handbooks or value statements? And then no documents at all. It was much more common to have employee handbooks and value statements than to have an ethics document.
So what type of documents do you envision those to be, like conflict of interest statements or things?
Yeah, conflict of interest. Also, what the organization stands for. Posing potential solutions and problems. Almost like a crisis management document. When the leadership encounters this is the stand that the organization will take. Yes?
So often with research of this sort, in a survey, you end up with more questions than the ones that you answered. What stones were left unturned? If you were to continue on, what would you hope to look at?
Well, I do hope to continue on. It's my intention right now that this is the first annual report. Hopefully this will take on its own life with myself as its steward for several years. I hope to examine further questions like, what is the audience perception of these values? How does that inform their experience and their attendance? What about the artists rather than the leadership? What about different sizes of theater specifically? Just LORC theaters or just small budget theaters? There are many more questions that were left unanswered, and this is only starting the work that I want to do. Any other questions?
David, one of the things we talked about was the idea that sometimes ethics are situational.
Yeah.
And so, how do you see that playing out in your results?
Well, with responses that say, well, it depends on the circumstances about how we'll follow the mission, or we follow the mission some of the time, that's situational. And I don't think it's ethical to situationally decide, well, this time we'll follow it and this time we won't. Ethical behavior and action is about holding yourself to a standard that's not necessarily a legal standard, but it's based on the values that the organization holds. And if you don't follow that standard, you need to ask if you really hold those values.
And do you think the current economic times influence ethics?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The biggest causes of concern are money and law and employment. Things like budgets and copyright and hiring practices were some of the most represented areas of ethical problems.
About 20 seconds left.
Already 20 seconds.
Any other questions?
In a nutshell, if you have an organization that's a community dialogue theater and strictly says in its mission nothing about artistic excellence or anything else, just about creating dialogue, would you see an issue with that organization? Would it sound like one that would it not create dialogue?
If the programming that they implement does create dialogue, I don't see a conflict. If it's creating a prescriptive value set, I do see a conflict, because you're not then promoting dialogue, you're promoting monologue.